Now, moving on to another issue here. For the first time since the pandemic began, more people want the government to prioritise protecting the economy over limiting the spread of coronavirus. That's according to a new pandemic priorities poll by Kext CNC. Let's take a look. 41% of people now favour protecting the economy versus just 38% who want to prioritise limiting the spread of the virus. That's an enormous drop compared to where things started out in April 2020. Just look at how that graph changes. For those listening on the radio, this is available on GBNews social media. Now, is COVID finally coming to an end, or should we still be cautious about it? Well, joining me now to discuss this is James Johnson, co-founder of JL Partners and senior advisor to Kext Polling. Welcome to the programme. This is a pretty extraordinary poll. I think a lot of people have for some time accepted that the British public has been very cautious when it's come to COVID. Whenever the government's announced a lockdown, they seem to have risen in the polls. Now it might not be the case.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things behind that. I think there's a lot of fatigue going on. This has lasted a long time. Even back in, late 2020, we saw people starting to tire of lockdowns and starting to feel frustrated by them. It's also the vaccine. This has been a big game changer in terms of people's own sense of their personal risk, so that they therefore feel that they can look at other things and prioritise them a little bit more. And it's also about what's going on in the news and going on in people's lives. We've got a huge cost of living crisis going on. We've got the war in Ukraine. When I ask people in focus groups now, what's the biggest issue facing the country? Or, how do you feel things are going at the moment? Very rarely does COVID come up. And I think you see that reflected in those figures.
It's remarkable because whenever the government has taken an easing step or moved to abolish certain restrictions, it has seemed to be unpopular in polling, particularly removing the requirement to self-isolate upon testing positive. That was wildly unpopular. Might the needle now have moved even on that issue?
Yeah, I think it does. And actually, if you look through, and actually that graph you showed there, when it changes, it tends to change after the government brings something in. So the government eases restrictions, whether that was in May 2020 when they first reopened after the first wave, or whether it was in recent changes. And when they loosen up first, the public say, oh, no, we don't like that. We're quite worried about that. But actually, about 3 or 4 weeks after it happens, support then swings behind it. So you see a situation throughout this pandemic, whether it's been closing or easing, that actually the public tend to follow where the government leads them. But I do think now that we're in a very different situation where if the government were to bring in any more restrictions, were to tighten things up again, I think we would see real resistance to that from the public, just as we saw actually in December and January with that Omicron wave. Lots of mutterings about whether there was going to be more restrictions, but actually under the surface of the polls, when you did those focus groups, when you talked to voters face-to-face, very much a sense of wanting to move on from it. So I think something has decisively shifted in that regard now, notwithstanding, of course, a major game changer or a new variant or something that shook that up. But as we are now, I think we'll see that picture continue to trend upwards.
And how much of that might be to do with the political situation, not just the pharmaceutical situation and, of course, the stupendous success of the vaccine rollout, but, of course, those stories of what ministers, even the Prime Minister, may have been up to during those lockdowns. Senior civil servants admitted to having partied during those restrictions as well. Might that have influenced the public here?
I think it has a little bit of a role. I think it makes people sort of, throw their hands up a bit and say, well, what's the point in bothering them? We certainly saw that a little bit after Dominic Cummings' famous trip to Barnard Castle back in 2020, and we've certainly saw that earlier in the year as well, though. I generally think, though, that when people jump on this and say, oh, this means the public are going to stop following everything and stop being careful, it's slightly patronising to the public. Actually, the public are a bit more grown up about this, maybe than some people who comment on this. I think generally they can separate that from actually what they feel they need to do for public health reasons.
Now, there used to be someone in the government who was really quite popular, no matter what was going on, and that was, of course, Chancellor Rishi Sunak. He has fallen into some pretty bad press over the last few days, with multiple stories coming out about him and, indeed, his wife. As we are now less than a month away from those local elections, things aren't looking too rosy for the Conservatives now.
I think the Conservatives are in a really difficult position. This is the first time in this Parliament I've actually wondered whether the Conservatives could actually fall short of a majority at the next election. All last year, Owen Paterson's situation, fights over wallpaper. I would say on GBNews and on other shows, it's not cutting through. It's not actually having an impact in the way that perhaps a lot of the commentariat think it is. But with that party situation in January, that really did seem to change everything. And that has not gone away. I sense that same anger in my focus groups. You see the same level of people saying they want Boris Johnson to resign over it if he's fined than when that question was asked back in January in the polls. that anger is still very much there, and I think that's changed a lot. And as you say, they've also lost now potentially one of their biggest assets in Rishi Sunak's popularity. And add to that mounting frustrations about the cost of living. Keir Starmer doing very well on that best PM tracker in a way that Ed Miliband never did when he was leader, or Jeremy Corbyn never did. I think we are heading towards a really difficult situation. I think the gap between what Conservative MPs think the public think and what the public actually think is widening and widening. I think a lot of MPs are sort of saying, oh, actually, the leadership issue is fine, the current situation is fine, we're going to have a strong narrative against Keir Starmer, we're going to use the culture war stuff, we're going to, beat Labour again in the Red Wall. Actually, with the public opinion, is actually heading in quite a different direction. So I think there's a real danger now that the Conservatives sleepwalk into a very difficult situation electorally.
Really fascinating. Well, the 5th of May is the date of those elections. We'll be watching very closely, but